Welcome to the Point Out Loud Women Trailblazers podcast, Series 4, on leading change in education and community engagement, brought to you by the UWSP Center for Equity, Development, and Leadership. Here at UW Stevens Point, we believe that transformative change begins with leaders who are passionate about education, health, and sustainability.
This series dives deep into the stories and insights of changemakers from all walks of life. Educators, advocates, and innovators who are shaping the future of our communities.
As Malala once said, when the world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful. Let's celebrate those voices and inspire action.
This next talk with Lauren Conaboy is going to be really great for you. She brings her mind to tell us about the work of policy and her heart to engage us in a conversation about how leaders cut through noise to provide something that we can all hold onto. If you've ever said in your life, I need help, or someone in your life has said, I need help, this session's for you. We're so excited to have you join us. Let's get started.
Welcome, Lauren. How are you?
I'm great. Yeah, so glad to be here.
Thank you. We're excited to have you. Could you start with telling us a little bit about yourself and giving us your backstory?
Yeah, so I currently work as the Vice President for National Policy for Centerstone. It is a nonprofit provider of mental health and substance use treatment services. We're across several states, but headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. And we also have a research institute focusing on bridging the science to service gap in mental health care. And so I head up our federal relations, government relations work, and then also a lot of our state work as well. And then in terms of, kind of what brought me to Centerstone and just kind of the mental health path, along the way, like at many of us throughout our life, I think we know between 1 and 5 people at some point will deal with a mental illness, and that will be most people throughout the course of their life. And so, younger looking back, probably high school and college was struggling with anxiety, but I don't think we had as much language around it at the time. And so it didn't really come to fruition for me until my mid-20s. I was in Washington, D.C. In a high-performing job. I had a bunch of stuff happen personally, several losses within our family and things, just kind of things piling up at the time. And then I started underperforming in my job. And that was really the first time that was happening. And I think at that point in my early 20s, something that I didn't know at that point in my career was it's okay when in your career to say if you're struggling with something, to say, I need help, or this project is not going well, I need some backup. But at that point in my career, I didn't have those kind of tools and that skill set. And that's something I also want young people to hear, is that as you're going into the job market and you're learning new things, you don't always have to say what you're doing well. You can also say where you need coaching. And that's something I think that's really important. So to kind of summarize this, around all of that, and I think underperforming in my job, it was also around the 2008 financial crash. At that point, I got laid off. And so for me, I've had so much of my identity around work and achievement most of my life.
Yeah.
And it was a big moment for me of kind of looking at, what does this mean? And at that point, I had a lot of anxiety around what that all looked like. And it was the first point in my life where I actually labeled it as anxiety, and I labeled it as I was struggling through these things from a mental health perspective. And I knew at that point I wanted to take a step back and figure out how to do things differently and do my career differently. At that point, I didn't know, but it planted the seeds for a multi-year process to figure out what that looked like. And I ended up in my late 20s going back to graduate school for a dual master's in clinical social work and marriage and family therapy, which is what brought me on this path.
Wow, that's so cool. What a journey. So what inspired you to pursue a career in mental health policy?
Like I said, a lot of that background. And then before going into that, I had done mostly policy and advocacy work, was working as a therapist, and even as a therapist, I think I even got more passionate working as a therapist about mental health because I saw all the barriers that families ran into. I worked both in a community mental health setting, which is primarily Medicaid, but I also did about a day and a half a week in our private practice setting, which was kind of usually like a cash only or sliding scale situation. And I saw people come in. One example that still kind of sticks in my mind is a family with a daughter with severe anorexia, and anorexia has a 10% mortality rate. and commercial insurance doesn't cover treatment for a lot of that. And so this family, the mom had stopped working, they had really started doing things to support this child and get her well. And I think I started thinking about, oh my gosh, there's so many barriers to really accessing quality mental health care. Mm-hmm. And mental health care that's evidence-based, comprehensive, really treats you as a whole person. And so at that point, it was kind of serendipitous because the community mental health organization I was working for was hiring for a director of government relations at the state level at the time. And they happened to remember that they had a therapist on staff that had close to 10 years of policy and advocacy experience prior to becoming a therapist. And so they just kind of cold called me one day and said, would you be interested in this and doing government relations work around mental health? And at first I was really, really enjoying the therapeutic work, but then I was like, I'll take the conversation. And that's something I think that's really important also for young people is always you take the conversation, even if you say no. I think having those dialogues can really open up doors. But yeah, so I sat down, I had the conversation, I ended up moving into that role. And so that's kind of what got me into marrying the two professions of policy and mental health.
I love that. I can see what the person who called you sees in you. So listeners, you're not seeing it, but Lauren has a really calm presence, doesn't she? Just composed and really smart, but somehow completely approachable in the same way. And articulate. So those are all things that seem really important for policy work, being able to untangle things. So that's the smarts, being that kind of neutral, approachable, so you can have really hard conversations. But also that approachableness that I think probably comes out of your therapeutic training. Am I reading you right?
Thank you for that. And I think a lot of us have a lot of those traits and can show up in different settings in different ways. And in the policy setting, I often say that the therapeutic background helps me a lot because when you're talking to lawmakers, you want to meet them where they're at.
Right, yeah.
Republican, Democrat, and I work mostly on the federal level, U.S. Senate or House. I often research who I'm going to meet with and kind of understand their background, understand their history to the degree you can, and then try to understand if they intersect with mental health at all. And it's hard to find somebody today that doesn't somehow intersect with mental health or hasn't been personally impacted by it. And so, it's that whole meeting people where they are and connecting with where they're willing to start the conversation and going from there.
That's so beautiful that we can, this is instructive for me that you can use that notion of meeting people where they're at in any field, right?
Yeah.
And then hearing about how you use that in policy and then finding those intersections.
Right. It's so cool to kind of see how life has guided you this far. I think we can all kind of relate to, being pulled in a different direction. That's really cool. I'm curious, how have you navigated some of these challenges that have been thrown your way?
It's really challenging to be a leader right now. The environment is changing. We have new executive orders that are law. So as companies and institutions, especially entities that receive federal contracts and funding, we have to be compliant with those applicable federal regulations and laws. At the same time, some of the changes are frightening to staff. Staff feel marginalized, and so there's a really strong challenge right now in threading the needle in both, maintaining a really welcome, inclusive environment, while also realizing that these new laws and executive orders are kind of the lay of the land that it's kind of the reality that we have to navigate as organization leaders. So I think that has been a challenge. Another thing is, a lot of time in politics, and this goes through the prior Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now there's moments where there's lots of noise in politics, and there's so much. There can be just a lot of media coverage, and I think in times like that, in terms of our organization, our staff feel a little bit of uncertainty, and they kind of look to the leaders saying, is there something we can hold on to that feels certain? Is there something that can be grounding in all of this? And so I like to talk to our team in terms of probabilities of here's what we know and here's what we see as the most probable scenario, because it is really easy to kind of look at in any life situation, X, Y, and Z, maybe there's a 5% of it happening or 3% of happening, but it's kind of maybe the worst case scenario, and you can spiral down that and get caught in that. And so I really try to keep our staff focused on here's the most probable scenario, here's what we know today. And in the case of mental health and behavioral health, um, we've had conversations across the aisle, Senate offices, House offices, that there still is really strong bipartisan support for mental health resources and funding. And so that's a message I continue to carry. But I do want to acknowledge that at this particular moment, I think there's economic uncertainty, there's other uncertainties, and so I think as organizational leaders that it is a difficult time, and I think part of our responsibility is to kind of cut through the noise and provide some sort of grounding messages and provide information of what we do know on a factual basis as well.
Yeah. Lauren, that feels like such a unifying call. I'm just going to say it the way I heard it. I've drawn it out on my paper. I've got noise on one side of my paper, and then I've got leaders provide something we can hold on to. I think that's just human. It doesn't matter, what our backgrounds are, what kinds of points of view we're coming from, where we agree or disagree, that we can all say, wow, here's this noise, right? And I can see in my organization, because I'm an informal or a formal leader, that I can show up here and provide something that people can hold on to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. And I love the way, from a policy perspective, you go into that as probabilities and scenarios, right? Very concrete. Different leaders are going to do that differently. But I can almost see your brain whirring, right? Calculating the probabilities, casting those into scenarios. That, probably because I'm a professor, that feels very comforting to me.
Yeah. It feels comforting to me to kind of, in a lot of the times we have conversations with different congressional offices or state offices, but whichever legislative audience we're referring to, we talk to our champions on both sides of the aisle, both chambers. We get a directional sense of where we're going. And then we kind of look at the vote count, and based on the vote count, I'm able to kind of say, this is the probable scenario. This is what we can anticipate. Yes, things could happen outside of that scenario, but most likely we're going to plan for this at this point, and then develop a plan B if needed.
Right. What kind of advice would you give to aspiring leaders wanting to make an impact in national policy or mental health?
I think first and foremost, we spend so much of our life in work, right? And when, if you kind of think about looking back at your life at the end, like, we dedicate a really, really big chunk of our life to work. We're away from, if people have children, we're away from our children, hobbies, etc. And so first and foremost, I think my advice is to pick something that both resonates with your personal and professional skill sets and strengths, as well as where you hold values, and if you can find a synergy between the two, and that can look really different in different ways. And I'm going to kind of go out of the mental health area for a little bit. Yeah. My husband's an engineer, and he's found a way to do that as an engineer as well.
Oh, wow.
And I think there's different ways, but however, in my mind, like, if you can find some fulfilling, purpose-driven aspect of what you're doing that aligns with your skill sets and your strengths, I think, and then along the way you seize the opportunities that come across your path, I think that sets individuals up for success.
Right. And how has your education at UW-Stevens Point shaped your approach to who you are today?
I look back at my time at UWSP really fondly. I think larger universities, University of Wisconsin, fantastic, amazing school. But I don't think you get the personalized experience you do at some of the smaller universities, like University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point.
Exactly.
I personally felt like I was, and it seems like you two might have this as well, but I personally felt like I was mentored by my professors.
Exactly.
I feel like, I think that was such a huge part of my career and coming into who I was as a young adult. And then just the community there was fantastic. the various extracurriculars and clubs that are available to, different interest groups. And so you kind of can find a peer network of people that are doing what you're doing or interested in. And so I think you've got that support. But I think the true kind of leadership professional development came from being at a smaller institution and having that professor mentorship and coaching.
I can personally agree to what you're saying, and I think this podcast itself is a great example of, professors and mentorship and the impact that UW-Stevens Point can have for students.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate your kind words. And, for a professor, I think I might be able to speak for all of us, even though our disciplines are really different. When a learner shows aptitude or interest in something we've devoted our lives to, it is just so rewarding to invest. So thanks for noticing that. It means a lot.
Yeah, and thank you for being there and, helping this next generation to kind of find their footing and everything and new opportunities.
Yeah.
It's role models like you guys that just really inspire and uplift and inspire us to keep going.
It's lovely. I'm giggling because as an organization founder, Serena founded a student organization here called Women in Business with another one of our fine professors, Dr. Deborah Beyer, and she's mentored young women here too. So we all have this lovely line of mentoring others. Yes. So I love that.
Me too. I love our little circle of support.
That's amazing.
It is. It really is incredible. On the topic of that, when you think about women and our role in society, what gives you the most hope?
I was reflecting on this, and there's a lot of different pieces. I have a 5-year-old daughter, or she's about to turn 5. I think, and I want to also start by saying every parenting model for whatever people are choosing is right for them. Every family has different circumstances. Something I'm really grateful for is, we're 2 full-time working parents with demanding jobs, and we parent in a really equitable way. And my parents did an incredible job with my sister and I growing up. But, I think my mom still had the lion's share of the child rearing responsibilities and all what we call kind of the invisible labor. And I think within my own relationship and marriage, I would say it feels really equitable. And so that's something I'm grateful for as a leader, to have that. And then within my peer group, I was thinking about this. I think I know more female breadwinners and more stay-at-home dads than I do stay-at-home moms. I know stay-at-home moms. I want to say both are amazing, and I applaud both. And so I just like that we have more optionality today, that we can figure out what works for our families and support that and support our careers. Across the board, seeing more women in leadership, more women in STEM. I'm based in Colorado, and I think I just saw the University of Colorado Boulder. They're now, it's now almost close to half the enrollees in the engineer program are female, and 20 years ago that was not the case. And so I just think we're seeing kind of, women play a really strong role in the workplace in ways that are just changing every day, and that's really exciting. But I also want to recognize that I think, diversity across the board is really important for companies. And there's a lot of research that when you have a diverse C-suite leading the organization, you can actually be a more impactful, dynamic, creative company, which I think is really exciting. And I hope we'll continue to kind of lean into those research and learnings to continue some of the work that we're seeing at that level.
I love that answer for 2 reasons. One, it locates us in the presence where there's choice. And I just heard you kept talking about the hope of choice, right? Parenting isn't a role. Leadership isn't a role that's assigned out. That this kind of who stays home, who goes to work, what that work looks like, what field you get to study in, that for you in the present, you see that as being informed by choice. And that choice gives you hope. And I loved the way you didn't stop there. You called us forward to a future where there's even more opportunities to be dynamic and creative when we have more difference in the room.
Yep.
Yeah. I love it. Thank you. That is hopeful.
And before we wrap up, what's one thing you'd like to ask all of our listeners to this podcast to do to further unleash women?
I think as women leaders, first and foremost, supporting each other in the workplace. You know, I've experienced it. Probably a lot of people have experienced it. Women can be critical of one another in the workplace. And so I think looking for opportunities to, mentor up and coming young leaders in the workplace, support them, coach them. The company I work for, we have a lot of language around coaching. And a while back, we did an executive coaching course. And for me, it's kind of, you ask the question, can I give you some coaching around this? And to see if someone's open to it. But I think it's created also an environment where we're there to help each other improve to our best selves professionally. And we're not competing against each other, and we're lifting each other up because we know that moves the mission forward as a whole. Yeah, and I think organizations as they're recruiting for new positions, being aware where there's bias and where, there's maybe institutionally a certain type of individual is that's in that work. And ultimately, we want the best skilled people for each role, but maybe we have to be a little bit more creative around recruitment to find that and to get to a more diverse pool and outside of the box of just a network that might already exist. So I think recruitment would be the other piece of it, and being really, really intentional about how do we get creative and think outside the box when we're recruiting for new roles.
Right. Yeah. I know every woman I know at least is super critical on themselves. So that's really great advice.
Yeah. But we also take it out on each other, right? I'm 58 now, so I'm less intimidated by women who are more beautiful, women who are more intentional about how they look, how they walk, right? I have had seasons of paying more and less attention to that, but I've never felt that I fit the prototype, right? I've got this alter ego that lives in my head. She's called Norma, and she makes fun of me whenever I'm trying to be too normal.
I love that. Oh my goodness.
Right, but I take that out on other women sometimes. So I do appreciate, Lauren, your insight here.
Right.
And I think you just gave a perfect example of a therapeutic approach called internal family systems. It's IFS in different parts.
Yeah.
And I think it is, we all have different parts. We have parts from our childhood, parts from our normal selves, or our where we want to go self. And I think kind of acknowledging those different elements as we develop and using those different voices to kind of elevate ourselves makes a lot of sense over time. Yeah. I also love that, I think at least what I heard from a reflection is that you're at the point in the career where you've kind of been able to, you've said I'm letting go of these expectations. I am in my own self. I'm here and I value who I am and what I bring to the table, which I think that's something that probably if we could look back at our 20-something selves that we would say, the sooner you can show up to that, the better.
Yeah. So listeners, I just want to say the space Lauren now has me in as a really powerful and skilled listener is I'm ready to get a bottle of wine, perhaps, pour us each a glass and spend some time here. And I think she just really role modeling the kind of support that we can offer one another. Thank you. I'm feeling really supported and like I want to go even deeper. I really appreciate your affirmation. Thank you.
Agreed. For me, this conversation was super healing, and what they say is true. You're an inspiration and a trailblazer, and we're so grateful that you took the time to talk with us today, and thank you so much for being an aspiring role model to leaders and at UWSP and across the world.
Oh, well, thank you both, and I love that you're doing this, and I was really grateful to be here.
Thank you for joining us for our 4th series on leading change in education and community engagement. We hope that these stories inspire you to create impact in your own community.
As Maya Angelou wisely said, you can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have. Let's take that with us into our work and our lives.
Be sure to tune in to our next series where we'll continue to explore powerful stories and innovative ideas.
Until then, keep inspiring, keep innovating, and keep leading change.